So in this video, we're going to look at the connection between trade and religion in Western Europe. And we're starting with the Reformation. So by 1500, the Roman Catholic Church had become really popular in Western Europe. And it had become really powerful and wealthy. And it had actually become so wealthy that people began to criticize the Catholic Church and suggest that maybe they were beginning to stray from Jesus' early teachings, or Jesus' teachings about simplicity and compassion for the poor. Because I think when people looked at the Catholic Church, all they saw was wealth and luxury, and that really wasn't what Christ had preached. So the leader of the Reformation was Martin Luther, and he opposed church power, and he opposed indulgences. And indulgences were like certificates that would make it so that you didn't have to spend as much time in purgatory for the sins that you had committed. So you could buy an indulgence to lessen your time in purgatory, or you could buy an indulgence to lessen someone else's time in purgatory. And purgatory is, of course, the Catholic belief that when you die, you have to first be purged of your sin. So with whips and chains and all kinds of torture devices, you are purged from your sin before you go to heaven. But if you bought an indulgence, then you could have a shorter sentence. And so Martin Luther said that was absolutely ridiculous and not scriptural. And he did not believe that the Pope had more spiritual authority than any other Christian. He believed in the priesthood of all believers. In other words, everyone can come to Christ or go to God themselves in prayer and not have to communicate with a priest to go to God. Just to mention another reformer, John Calvin was another reformer, and he believed that the church had no authority over salvation, that God predestined certain people to be saved. And so if he did, then you were either saved or you weren't, but the church didn't really have a say in the matter. And so these are just some of the early reformers, and I know we're like breezing through this topic really quickly, but we'll cover it with more detail in European history. And so just to throw another name in here, this guy wasn't intentionally a religious reformer, but he did bring complete religious change to England. And this is Henry VIII, and he is famous for having 6 wives. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, did not produce him a male heir. And so because the Pope would not grant him a divorce, he used this as an opportunity to really rid England of the power of the Pope. And he broke away from the Catholic Church and started his own church, becoming the supreme head of the state and the church, which was an Anglican church. And even though this looked and sounded a lot like a Catholic church, it was a Protestant church. And so even though he really wasn't intending to be a reformer, I guess, in many ways he did bring the Reformation, or in every way he brought the Reformation to England as well. And so the response to this, the Catholic response to this, was the Catholic Reformation. And the Catholic Reformation came out of the Council of Trent. And at the Council of Trent, they met on and off for about 18 years, from 1545 to 1563. And the purpose of it was just to address questions of church doctrine and to look inward to see if they needed to make any type of religious reform. And so basically, this is what it boiled down to. They reaffirmed their basic doctrines, like communion and baptism and things like that. They reasserted the necessity of a celibate clergy. Celibacy is when you do not get married. And so they reasserted that it was necessary for clergymen to not marry. They called for greater religious devotion from the clergy. They created religious orders to try to purify the church, because when, taking inventory of their habits, they realized that there was some purification that needed to take place within the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church really wanted a single universal church. So they even initially invited Protestants to the Council of Trent, but it just didn't happen. Protestants encouraged separate nation states, and the Catholic Church wanted a single universal giant church. I want to insert here just a quick topic, Spanish defeats. And we talked in the last chapter about how, that's defeats, not defeats. We talked in the last video, about how the Spanish began to decline because they did not have the economic infrastructure in place to channel all of this silver coming in from the New World into their own treasury. And the Dutch really beat them at that. And so with the Counter-Reformation, Spain initiated the Spanish Inquisition. And this was basically just torment for non-Catholics. And it was the brutal, forced conversion of people who were not Catholic. And so the Netherlands, who at this point were dominated by Spain, feared that King Philip of Spain would extend the Inquisition there. And so they appealed to England for help in fighting off their Spanish governors. And so Elizabeth I of England opposed Spanish power as well. And so she supported Protestants across Europe, including the Netherlands. And so England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, and after that, Spain entered a long period of decline. And on top of it, the flow of gold from the Americas ended in the mid-1600s. And so this allowed for the dominance of other European nations, the first of which was the Dutch Republic. And we know one of the strengths that they had was that they were very economically efficient. And one of their main industries was the fishing industry, particularly herring. And 1 out of 4 Dutch people were involved in the herring industry. But by the 1600s, they dominated Northern European shipping. They had developed all kinds of commercial institutions, like banks. They had developed new methods of crop rotation, planting different crops in different seasons so that there would be a constant influx of food. And they set up the Dutch East India Company, which was a joint stock company that was simply dedicated to trade in Asia. And they embarked on all kinds of commercial ventures in Asia, even displacing the Portuguese. And on top of that, they reached the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America as well. And as much as they would have liked to dominate Europe, including England, they were unsuccessful in doing that. Ultimately, they could not retain their supremacy. And that was mainly due to the English Navigation Act of 1651, which permitted imports to England and its dependencies only in English ships or in those of exporting country. And this effectively restricted Dutch shipping and brought an end to their dominance. Okay, so France. In the second half of the 1500s, France experienced about 40 years of civil war, and it all boiled down to Catholic versus Protestant. 40 years of fighting over that one thing. And the Protestants in France are called Huguenots, so when you read your book, you'll see that, but this is basically French Calvinist Protestants. And so in 1859, Henry of Navarre comes to the throne, and he's called Henry IV in France. And he is actually a Protestant king, and it's said that he stated Paris' worth en masse and converted to Catholicism. I don't know that he actually said that, but he did convert to Catholicism to try to bring peace between Protestants and Catholics, or to at least appease the Catholics who were the majority. And hoping to heal the schism between the religious communities, he also issued the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes basically said that Protestants can have the same civil rights as Catholics. And so it basically gave them the right to go to their own worship services as long as they were outside of Paris, and as long as someone could come in and listen to their message to make sure that they weren't preaching anything that was anti-French or anti-Catholic. And so this did not work out for Henry IV, as he was assassinated by a Catholic militant. And so his successor was Louis XIII. And you've probably heard a lot about Cardinal Richelieu, who was the chief minister to Louis XIII. Just a political and tactical genius. But listening to Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIII built up France's armies, and he made allies with their French neighbors and encouraged his nobles to invest in trade by land and sea. And so this really helped to strengthen state control over the national economy of France. And so the material needs of the army stimulated the economy. The army was large, and they needed clothing and food and weapons. And so that actually stimulated many different industries, just fueling and supplying the army. And then we can't fail to mention Louis XIV. Louis XIV was the famous Sun King who said, "I am the state." He had like several people come help him get dressed in the morning. Everything was ritualistic, and basically the sun revolved around Louis XIV. Despite that, though, he was a powerful and very efficient king. And so one of his best assets was his economic advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And I'll put his name up here because it's important. And Colbert came up with this idea of mercantilism. And you've probably seen this a little bit in the last chapter, and I think at the beginning of this chapter that we're currently in. But mercantilism is just setting up a favorable balance of trade, whereby the government exports, or they ship out, more than they import. And so the goal is to sell more than you're buying, and so that you can buy from your own country. So you're pouring all of your money into your own country, and everybody else's money is also coming into your own country because you're exporting lots of goods and they are paying for them. And so in addition to that, to facilitate trade, Colbert abolished local taxes on trade throughout central France, in order to encourage people to engage in trade. Another economically brilliant thing that Colbert did was that he encouraged guilds and thereby set quality standards for like craftsmen and hand manufacturers, and gave financial incentives to manufacturers of luxury goods like tapestries and woolens and glass and silk. And so the growth of the French military and their growing economic strength began to disrupt the balance of power in Europe, and France was growing extremely powerful. France would also face decline, though, in a couple of wars, the War of the League of Augsburg and then the War of Spanish Succession would reduce their power when they were forced to give up territory to the British, basically. So that brings us to England, and we've already talked about the dominance issues between France and England, and because of the loss of the 7 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession, and the War of Spanish Succession, the British rose to the top. After the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as it's called in Europe, the French were forced to give up their land in North America to the British. They were forced to give up some of their land in India as well. And even after the Revolutionary War, when the 13 colonies achieved their independence from Great Britain, Britain still had Canada, and they still had Caribbean islands where they were making tons of profits off the sugar industry. And they even increased their holdings in India and were by and large dominating the sea in both the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And this was because Britain was institutionally better than all other European countries, even the Netherlands. And they did this by first recognizing the importance of a stable currency. And the English had fixed the value of the pound sterling in 1560 and 61 at 4 ounces of silver. And they maintained that for 2.5 centuries. Not to mention their impressive banking system. The Bank of England, which was started in 1694, could transact its business with their fixed currency. They never defaulted on their debts, and so they earned the trust of every other nation. And in times of war and peace, Britain could borrow whatever money they needed because they paid their debts. And so politically, with the constitutional monarchy, that gave strong support to private commercial interests as well. So really, Britain, because they were institutionally superior, they rose to the top of the ladder in Europe.